I've spent the past few hours updating the rankings on the site, and these are the guys that have moved down after the Sunday games, starting with the players that are not moving too much, then getting to the real panic options. I'm starting with DK Metcalf here. Yeah, it was a down performance. Yeah, you only had 7.5 fantasy points. The main concern you can maybe have with Metcalf is the fact that there were a ridiculous amount of pass attempts and a ridiculous amount of dropbacks in this game. Like if you're looking at what you had from Geno Smith, this is yet another game where all of a sudden you have to have 44 dropbacks. I mean, even against the Giants, I was expecting that possibly they were going to be able to run the ball a little bit more. And with those 44 dropbacks, you have 4 receptions for DK Metcalf. Lockett gets volume. JSN gets volume. Noah Fant plays a little bit more. Now, obviously, am I moving Metcalf down dramatically? No, he's still a locked and loaded wide receiver 2 that you start every single week. I think it's more so that just Stephon Diggs moved ahead of him, so he only fell down to wide receiver 20. I'm moving this over to our next guy. Harrison is a receiver that moves down one slot to Garrett Wilson. Obviously, down performance for Harrison. I mean, in a game where Kyler, yes, is able to find success. Honestly, a lot of that as a rusher obviously helps our fantasy teams, but doesn't help our fantasy teams for where you have Harrison. Harrison only had 2 receptions for 36 receiving yards, but I will say it was a really tough matchup against the Niners, right? And at the end of the day, Harrison, still a rookie wide receiver that if you're looking at what he's done so far this year, you have 3 games with over 15 fantasy points. So I still believe that Harrison is a wide receiver 1 in the long term. We really only moved him down from wide receiver 10 to wide receiver 11, so not really a faller. Our next guy, Andrews, I'm ready to tell you that, yes, you can go ahead and cut him. And which is funny to say because Mark Andrews just had the best game of his NFL season in week 5, and now he is falling down our rankings to tight end 19. The reason being is while the stat line looks good and the fantasy points at the end of the day, where you get the 9.5 in a full PPR format, it's better than what you previously had. You can no longer blame the passing volume for the fact that these other tight ends are outproducing Andrews. You have 348 passing yards for Lamar Jackson and 4 passing touchdowns. You have 42 pass attempts, and Andrews sees 5 targets. Charlie Kolar, I mean, literally only plays, runs 9 routes, or 6 routes, I apologize. And the man sees 3 receptions, 64 receiving yards, and the receiving touchdown. Isaiah likely scores 2 receiving touchdowns. So even in a game where Lamar pushes for 400 total yards, Andrews is still not viable. Andrews down to tight end 19 in my rest of season ranks. I think you just go ahead and let him go. Our next guy will be Jordan Mason. Jordan Mason, actually kind of a quiet loser here. It was a great matchup that you had against the Arizona Cardinals. And not only does Jordan Mason give you the worst game that he has had this year in fantasy football with only 8 points, but at the same time, the underlying usage is a little concerning. You have another running back in this backfield seeing 5 carries in comparison to Jordan Mason only at 14. Obviously, we've said it all year now that Jordan Mason won't be a running back that catches the ball very often. I mean, if you're looking at his targets so far this year, he's at 8 targets through 5 games. So I don't know. I think also we're another week closer to McCaffrey coming back. I have Jordan Mason RB 18 rest of season. Our next guy will be David Njoku. With Njoku, I'm just a little bit concerned that this offense is going to make it where it doesn't matter how talented he is, how much volume he sees. And same thing that you have with Amari. You have 125 passing yards for Deshaun Watson. We have not had a single game this season with over 200 passing yards for Watson. And if we do not get Jameis Winston in here at some point, it will be a spot where even if David Njoku historically has been a very efficient tight end, obviously crushed at the end of last year with Joe Flacco, just looks like it's going to be a very different offense and a severely capped ceiling based off the quarterback play. Now, obviously, if Jameis comes in, very different story. We have Njoku at tight end 11 behind Kraft, Pitts, and Goddard. And then Cortland Sutton is another slight faller, obviously similar to these other guys, not falling a ton. Wide receiver 53. You weren't excited about Sutton before, definitely not excited about Sutton after. I mean, this is finally a game where you can say, oh, the Broncos are in control. Finally a game where they're favored. You get 2 passing touchdowns from Bo Nix. And what comes from this? Cortland Sutton, 5.2 fantasy points. Finally, the best day of Bo Nix's NFL career, you get 5.2 points for Sutton. So I don't see what world you could ever potentially start Sutton. I have him ranked behind like Wan'Dale Robinson, Keenan Allen, Calvin Ridley. I think at this point, he's kind of becoming a player that you could consider dropping for the waiver wire options. Now, Deebo Samuel, another guy that's not going to be moving down too much for us. Obviously, Deebo Samuel, very poor performance. You only have 3 fantasy points. You are getting some of these artificial touches around the line of scrimmage with no McCaffrey, which we do like to see. You have another 3 carries for Deebo Samuel in this game. So it is a little good to know for chasing upside here that the rushing involvement for Deebo in this offense is still there. I expect it to still be one of the better offenses in the NFL. You have the massive pop for Brandon Ayuk, which is what takes away from Deebo. This is the first game that we've had from him all year where you have seen fewer than 10 fantasy points. So, I mean, I moved Deebo Samuel behind Cooper Kupp, Chris Godwin in our rest of season rankings, especially as we get the report that Kupp looks like he may be back in week 7. Now, going over to what we have with Brian Robinson. Brian Robinson has his worst day in fantasy football this year with only 7 rushing attempts. The man manages to somehow squeeze away multiple touchdowns. Obviously, it's a game environment that it's very difficult to take away a lot from. I mean, this is just a complete blowout. Brian Robinson was banged up coming into it. But right now, it looks like this Jeremy McNichols usage may be a little sticky. Obviously, this is a blowout. So I'm not moving Brian Robinson down our rankings too much, even if Eckler leads the backfield in snaps, even if Eckler leads the backfield in targets. Weird game environment. Brian Robinson was banged up. We have him as a locked and loaded running back 2 play every week at RB20, right behind James Conner, Jordan Mason, and Najee Harris. And then going over to our next player, Davian Wix, was a massive letdown. I heard in the live stream that a lot of people are going in on the higher 47.5 receiving yards for Davian Wix on Underdog this week. Obviously, does not come close to that, but I'll save you. Don't worry. We're going to go Chris Olave higher than 59.5 receiving yards for the game tonight over on Underdog. If you want to tell me with that, of course, you can find that link in the description and comment section. If you use promo code FLOCK on Underdog, you'll get a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. Plus promo code FLOCK, you will get a free Patrick Mahomes pick, more than less than half a total yard for the game tonight. And you'll get hooked up with a free team review over there on flockfantasy.com. You can find that link in the description and comment section. Now, looking at Wix, the concern is, yes, he does play a career high snap rate and route participation rate. But at the same time, what happens when you have Romeo Doubs back this next week? What happens if Christian Watson comes back 2 weeks from now? And Davian Wix goes right back to being the player that he was before, where you're playing 46, 51, 46% of the snaps in this offense. And he wasn't viable in the game where, I mean, he ran 24 out of a potential 29 routes. So if he's not viable right now in a great matchup against the Rams with both Watson and Dobbs out, I don't know how you can trust them going into the future. So with Wix in our rest of season rankings, we have him wide receiver 45. We have him right behind guys like Keon Coleman and Rashid Shaheed. Now going over to our next player, we will be looking at Sam Darnold. With Darnold, obviously, very bad game where you get the 5.26 fantasy points. You have the interception. They blame the fumble on him. It seemed like more like a Ty Chandler fumble to me, but regardless. The stat line looks horrendous for Sam Darnold. Now, I'm sure the majority of people are watching this game. It was an island game. We were streaming and watching it at the same time. To be honest, I think it's just kind of a little bit of a fluke. 1, it was a game in London. 2, sportsbooks had a low total on it. You should have known not to start Darnold in the first place. And 3, a lot of the passing volume that he had kind of got cheated away with defensive pass interference. So honestly, going into the future, Darnold's not any different than he was for me through the first 4 weeks. He's the streaming quarterback that you're going to be banking on passing touchdowns from, where you're going to have no rushing upside whatsoever. And that was a quarterback to be very excited about through the first 4 weeks when he's sitting there with 11 touchdowns and leading the NFL in touchdowns. Now, in terms of our rankings rest of season, we still have him alongside the other quarterbacks that aren't going to run the ball at all. some alongside the guys that you are just banking on the passing touchdowns from. We have Brock Purdy, we have Kirk Cousins, we have Jared Goff all ahead of him. It is good for Darnold that, you will get Hawkinson back into this offense relatively soon. Now, our next guy that, honestly, I think we need to move even further than this down is going to be Daltoncade. Kincaid, it falls behind Kittle for us, but honestly, we have to move Kincaid even further. I think you can make an argument to have Dalton behind Sam Laporta, behind Jake Ferguson, and behind Tucker Kraft. So we're going to do that right now. I'm going to update this ranking over on the site. And of course, we are tinkering with the rankings on flockfantasy.com literally every single day. Of course, the expert rankings are always free for you on the site, flockfantasy.com, which is the average of all the experts. If you want to see mine, just hit @expert Mason Dodd. If you're a paid member of the site, you should see my exact ones. But regardless, I think we probably have to move Kincaid behind Laporta and behind Ferguson, because the passing volume is not here in this offense the way that you thought it would be, or at least the way that I thought it would be. And Kincaid, so far this season, you were sitting with a total of 1 game with double-digit fantasy points. And that 1 game is the one that you had the receiving touchdown in. He has 0 games with 50 receiving yards. This next week in our rankings, if you have no Christian Watson, I will for sure have Tucker Kraft ahead of Dalton Kincaid in the week 6 ranks. Rest of season, I still probably put Kraft behind Kincaid just because you are going to get the additional wide receivers in Green Bay as they come back in, taking possibly a few more targets here. But yeah, Kincaid has to fall. Josh Allen has to fall here as well. In this offense, we have not had a single Josh Allen game with 300 passing yards. We've had 1 Josh Allen game with 250 plus passing yards. And we've had 2 Josh Allen games with fewer than 150. The passing volume is not nearly as exciting as we initially thought it would be. Even with the rushing, Josh Allen has not been getting there the same way that some of these other quarterbacks have been. So I've officially moved Josh Allen down to the QB4 in my rest of season ranks. I have him directly behind Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, and Jaden Daniels. Now moving this over to Deontay Johnson. Deontay had been, an absolute crusher when the Panthers offense looked decent. Weeks 3 and weeks 4, the man had 27 total targets in that 2-week stretch. You had 200 total yards. You had 2 receiving touchdowns. He looked great. And the Panthers offense goes through and they collapse. You could get a little Bryce Young action in. Obviously, it was a very, very tough matchup going up against the Chicago Bears. Deontay Johnson, I think if we assume that this Panthers offense is back to being a bottom 3 unit in the league, has to go back to not being a locked-in wide receiver 2 and instead is more so a flex option. So we have moved Deontay Johnson down to wide receiver 28 in our rest of season rankings. I am very interested to see what sportsbooks do with the implied team total for the Carolina Panthers in week 6. I will point out as well that Xavier Legette is injured. So now you have no Legette, you have no Adam Thielen. So Deontay is still going to get funneled a ridiculous amount of targets. Now going over to Tank Dell. Tank Dell will set up in a perfect way this week. I'll say 1, kind of feel bad. It's set to buy low on Tank Dell. 2, kind of helps my underdog teams. Did not draft the guy at all this year. But you had Nico Collins go down. And looking at the Texans offense post Nico Collins injury, Tank Dell had 13% of the targets in comparison to Dalton Schultz at 20%, Stephon Diggs at 27%. Tank Dell has been garbage this season. You played 4 weeks. You're averaging about 7 fantasy points per game. He has not had a single game with more than 7 targets. The man is averaging about 5 targets per contest. If Nico Collins misses, to be honest with you, I definitely think that Tank Dell looks like he will be in flex consideration. But looking at the usage that we've had now over a larger sample, especially with no Nico in this offense, we can say if Nico does come back, which obviously he will be, the question is when does he come back? This week, next week, the week after? I don't know. In any game that Nico Collins and Stephon Diggs is fully healthy, Tank Dell, you cannot consider starting. Now, going over to our next guy, we'll have Chuba Hubbard. With Chuba Hubbard, obviously, Jonathan Brooks is a threat to come back any second now. And you also have this Panthers offense going back down to possibly being a bottom 3 unit in the NFL. Now, obviously, Hubbard gets there this past week because you have, honestly, a great day overall, both with the rushing yards, rushing touchdown, and the receiving usage. -2 receiving yards, but you get the cheap 4 receptions in a PPR league. But I mean, you go back to how bad this Panthers offense was in weeks 1 and 2. There you had 1.4 and 11.6 points for Chuba Hubbard. Now, of course, if this offense rebounds and Jonathan Brooks does not come back in, then Hubbard should go right back to being that high-end RB2. Now, with that being said, if Jonathan Brooks is active, there's no way in hell you can start Chuba Hubbard. Even if Hubbard does have a role from week-to-week perspective, you cannot trust a committee back in a garbage offense. And that carries us over to our next guy with Jerome Ford. With Ford, I mean, the man's averaging fewer than 10 carries per game. The usage as a receiver dips down this past week. The snaps dip down. You have a little more Deonta Foreman. But the main thing is Nick Chubb is now a threat to potentially come back this next week in week 6. You cannot trust a running back in a running back by committee. Jerome Ford may no longer be startable in fantasy football. That's why we have Jerome Ford like behind guys like Kareem Hunt, Bucky Irving. It's like, I mean, Bucky Irving, I could see eventually taking over as the starting running back in a better offense. And then our next guy will be Travis Etienne. Travis Etienne, you can make an argument that Etienne's the largest faller. Right now we have him at 2. It looks like Etienne may be transitioning over to being more so a third down back and Tank Bigsby more so the first and second down back. What could save Etienne is even in a game where Bigsby balls out and Etienne looks like a relative garbage, to be honest. I mean, 2.83 yards per carry. And what should have been the best spot of the season, I thought Etienne was a good buy low candidate. I was looking at this going, okay, sportsbooks are saying the Jags offense is going to be better. Coaching staff saying Etienne's their guy, blah, blah, blah. Clearly, that's not the case. Etienne, 6 carries, but you do get the 7 targets for 43 receiving yards. So full BBR format, Etienne may still be viable. His coaching staff still saying that he is the guy. I have him ranked RB24, right behind guys like Tony Pollard, Jonathan Brooks, Nick Chubb. Not as a must-start player, but a player that's in flex consideration. And then going over to the Jets backs, both Breece Hall and Braylon Allen take a hit. The offensive line looks garbage. They did have a really tough matchup. I probably overreacted a bit here to move Breece Hall down to running back 9. Instead, Breece probably going to be ahead of Devon Achane, given the injury that you have to Achane. We're for sure putting Breece ahead of Achane. Breece will be running back 8 in these rankings, but I think you do have to move him behind at least Jonathan Brooks and Kenneth Walker, where base expectation coming into the season was the Jets were an above average offense. That's what sportsbooks were projecting. But based off what we've now had so far through the first 5 weeks, it is very difficult to assume that's going to be the case. We get a season low 4 targets for Breece Hall here as well. We've actually seen now 3 straight weeks where the receiving usage has dipped, where through the first 2 weeks, he was averaging 7 targets a game. Through the past 3 weeks, you're slightly lower than 5 targets a game. You're averaging about 20 receiving yards per contest. So if he splits the backfield with Braylon Allen and you don't have that large of a receiving role, it's hard to view him as a true elite running back. Obviously, still somebody that you're starting every single week, regardless of the matchup is, as your running back 1, but maybe he's not the running back 1 overall. Now, I think that's all we got for this. Of course, if you enjoyed it, please go down there, hit that like, subscribe to the channel if you play fantasy football. And of course, we'll be answering all your questions in the live stream tonight, tomorrow, the next day. So just make sure you're subscribed. And if you wanted to get a team review in one of those live streams, definitely the best way or the cheapest way to do it is take advantage of the offer that we have with Underdog Fantasy. Go over to Underdog Fantasy, use promo code FLOCK. You'll get a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. You'll get that free Patrick Mahomes pick more than less than half a total yard. If you want a pick 'em for tonight, I'm going Chris Olave higher than 59.5 receiving yards. Also, if you wanted that free team review voucher, just make sure you set up an account on flockfantasy.com with the same email address as your account on Underdog Fantasy. That way I know who should hook up with that free team review. But I appreciate you. Really hope we were able to help you out. I really hope I get to hang out with you on the live stream later tonight.